Absolutely. So nice to see everyone. My name is Hillary Brassett, and it's lovely to be with you all. I've been to a few family office events actually in the last year and in years past. My background is in technology and often the intersection with social change and specifically democracy. And I joined Open Secrets in January as the incoming executive director. And so Marty invited me to come here today to share a little bit with you about what we saw from a data perspective in this last election cycle, and also what to heed as we head into a new administration in 2025. So I'm going to share my screen and make sure you all can see this. Are we good?
Yes, it's coming up. Yep.
Cool. All right. All eyes on the 2025 political transition. So I want to start with a basic question, and this is a silly one, but I'm just curious, and show of hands, who followed the election this past month? Hopefully everyone. And just one more question for you all. I know we've been talking about data, we've been talking about investing. I'm curious how much money you would all estimate was spent across the political landscape, so not just in elections, but also in lobbying in this past 2024 cycle. Any guesses? A billion, 10 billion,
No, 40 billion.
10 million, 40 billion.
5 billion.
I'm going with 100.
It's $20 billion.
Holy smokes.
So this spans not just the election cycle at both the federal and state levels, but it also includes lobbying spending. This is actually an underestimate. And I just want to name that politics is not an every 4-year kind of thing. It's not an every 2-year kind of thing. It's a year-round 24/7 thing. We're going to get into that because 2025 is no outlier. Just because there are no elections, we're going to see action. But how do we evaluate this number? So Open Secrets has been tracking political spending for the last 40 years. And what you're seeing on this chart is an exponential rise, specifically between 2016 and 2020. The spend on the presidential election, which is the yellow bar, more than doubled. And we're going to get into a little bit of why that's the case, but overall you can see that it continues to rise, and this past year was no different.
Does that include the Zuckerberg money?
Which Zuckerberg, which version?
In 2020.
Yeah,
400 million.
it would include all of the spending in the election, so yes. And I just want to mention too that where is all this money coming from? What we do at Open Secrets is we categorize all donations. Any $200 plus donation is considered a large donation. And so all of the light blue sections of this bigger rectangle is the number of $200 plus donations relative to the overall money raised. And so what we notice in this graph is that less than 1% of the US population has contributed more than 78.12% of all contributions. So essentially a majority of the funding in the election cycle is coming from less than 1% of the population.
And that includes corporates?
Yes, yeah. So, and what's interesting is that the United States habitually outspends elections relative to other nations. This is an article in the Wall Street Journal that a reporter worked with us on to qualify our elections against other countries. And on the left-hand side, you can see we're vastly more costly than most other countries. And the most interesting graphic, I think, is on the right-hand side, where you can see quite clearly how much our two leading candidates outraised and outspent those in, England.
Wow.
So as I mentioned, I lead an organization called Open Secrets, and we have a website that allows you to search all of these trends and more. You can look up any donor. You could look up your neighbor and see their political giving history. I know a lot of law firms use our data for KYC vetting for any hires, to identify conflicts of interest, etc. You can dive into lobbying data, as I mentioned, contributions data. We're also the only source of foreign lobbying money as well. And we do believe our data enables transparency, which is essential to building trust. And as I mentioned, we've watched this trend since the 80s. We published a big, thick book that measured 3 inches tall and 1,500 pages deep. And you could go to the library and you could check out the book. You could look up different members of Congress to see who is spending money or donating to their campaigns. And today we have essentially these four main buckets of data. We track campaign spending, election spending, fundraising spending, we track lobbying and industry and foreign influence. We also historically have tracked the net worth of members of Congress, so you can see what they've made on stock trades, etc. And we also track ballot measures at the state level. So interestingly, this state, Florida, had the most costly ballot measures by far in 2024 with the ballot measure on marijuana and abortion. They topped the list across the entire country.
How much?
Oh, in the hundreds of millions. Yeah, you can see that on our site. And what we've also noticed is that in an era of mis and disinformation, we have about 7 million unique annual visitors to our site. And when a real world event happens, people come to our site and want the primary source data themselves. So this photo is an image of what? Who can identify this image? Yes, the attempted assassination on Donald Trump's life in Pennsylvania. I, just out of curiosity, went to our site. We logged trending searches in the last 24 hours. And I looked up just to see, and what do you notice there in the upper left-hand corner?
Thomas.
Oh, you can't read. Thomas Crooks, which was the name of the gentleman who attempted the assassination on Donald Trump's life. Within 24 hours of the assassination attempt, this was the #1 search on our website. People wanted to know what his political giving history was. Did he have a political motive? They were trying to get to the primary source themselves. To us, this indicates a growing and increased desire, especially by younger generations, to want to access the primary source. So what exactly happened this year? This time, as Mari shared, money did not win. Despite far outraising Donald Trump, Kamala Harris lost the election. This is an anomaly because usually money wins. There's an over 80% correlation where those candidates who raise and spend the most money win. And in fact, in the last year, for the House and Senate, that correlation was 93% and 95%. Whereas this presidential case is definitely an outlier. You can see this in the data on the right-hand side. We tracked this over the last 2 decades. In addition, this past year, outside spending, which refers to, often colloquially referred to as super PACs, which are independent organizations that spend on behalf of the candidate but cannot coordinate directly with the candidate, set a record year for the amount of money spent. And you can see in this chart, just exponentially, that outside spending figure has increased since 2 very specific Supreme Court cases, Citizens United, as well as Speech Now versus FEC, which happened in the district court, and basically allowed corporations to give politically without any boundaries, and created this version of the super PAC, which could accept unlimited donations and spend on behalf of the candidate, insofar as there wasn't direct coordination, but that's a very loosely held phrase. In addition, dark money also sent a record. Now, dark money is a term that I'm sure some of you have heard, and basically it refers to the instance of a shell company or a corporation that gets set up to receive donations in a clandestine way from somebody, and then the C4 entity basically gives that money to the super PAC C3, which can spend in support or against a candidate. The C3 has to disclose its donors, but insofar as one of those donors is a C4, we don't know the true origin of that money. So here on this chart, you can see overall there's been an increase in the amount of dark money. In other words, our team cannot necessarily identify the origin of the funds. And in addition, you're seeing that in general, that percent of overall dark money spending by these independent committees like super PACs has increased. Basically what this means is that wealthier individuals have continued to wield greater financial influence on campaigns, and often in clandestine ways. And at Open Secrets, we do believe transparency is necessary for a healthy democracy and a healthy economy, for that matter. I've spoken at a few libertarian gatherings this past year, and they're also very interested in making sure that we have transparency for equal access to the market. Yes.
Right, and there was this big controversy with Act Blue and Swiss billionaires' money and things like that. I mean,
yeah, that doesn't necessarily, we don't work directly into that. We're more focused on the transparency component of it, but yes, yeah.
So how much is dark of the $20 billion?
That this past year is about 1.1 billion.
So it means we have no idea who that $1 billion is.
Unless we do, our team will in some cases do what we like to call a shoe leather research, where our team will dig up a bunch of 990s, they'll go into kind of the history of where the money might have come from and try to identify the origin.
What about these low income people that made multiple donations that, added up to thousands of dollars?
Is that the Act Blue controversy?
That's another part of the Act.
Yeah, we didn't do direct, we download Act Blue's donations twice a year. And otherwise, most of our data we get from the FEC, which the Act Blue does go through the FEC. And then we add value to that data because we code every data point by industry, which doesn't come with the FEC data, which allows us to get the viewpoint of like, what are lawyers giving to? What about the securities and investments sector, et cetera? And again, if money equals free speech, we do believe we have to know the interlocutor. This is a really interesting data point as well. As I mentioned, we tracked this for several decades. Over the years, $1 million plus donations have drastically increased. So in 2004, the number of females who gave $1 million donation or more were 3. 20 years later, that increased to 128 females who gave to the tune of $546 million in this last year, with just $1 million plus donations. With men in 2004, that was 20 men who gave $1 million plus donations for $50 million. This year, that was 343 men who gave $1 million plus donations. That totaled $2 billion alone in 2024.
Are you gonna make this deck available to us?
Yeah, I can show these. Another interesting tidbit that's a net new thing that we haven't seen before is in this past year, Republican mega donors dominated the top 10 mega donors list, which we track. Historically, this is quite balanced between both sides of the aisle, but the top 7 of the top 10 were all donations that went to Donald Trump. Similarly, we also have a list of the top 10 donating organizations, which might span both a company or a committee or an organization writ large. And so you can see another way that we categorize our data is, say, for example, you see SpaceX on here, which of course is Elon Musk's company. And so anybody who works at SpaceX, those employee contributions would be rolled up under that company's umbrella.
So you just, if you go back to that slide,
Yeah.
you just assume that Andreessen Horowitz and Ripple would be oriented towards a libertarian point of their crypto. Ripple's a crypto company.
Yeah, so sorry, that was loud. So it's hard to see here, but on the very left-hand side, you can see a thin line, and that indicates the political leaning. So number 7 is actually quite squarely in the middle. Andreessen Horowitz must have given pretty evenly across both sides of the aisle, whereas Ripple is slightly blue leaning, which means that they gave a little bit more leaning to the left.
Oh, I see the one. Okay, got it.
Yep.
Interesting.
And you could, of course, click into Ripple and see specifically who they gave to on our website.
And okay, got it.
So the big takeaway for this year is we saw more money in this year, more undisclosed money, and more millionaire donors. And so the real question is, what should we look out for in 2025? As I mentioned, this is a year-round industry. Every year, more than $3 billion annually is spent in lobbying, and you can see that that's also increased over the last several years. And this year, as in every year, pharma tops the list, followed by tech, followed by insurance, followed by real estate and investment. So you can see we both categorize industries by how much they spend on lobbying and also by sector. And so pharma, you can tell, is the top of the list by a lot more. They're close to 300 million, and the second to them is at 189 million.
But is there a red line or a blue line there?
No, because this is lobbying. And so the previous slides were all campaign contributions, direct contributions, whereas this is lobbying spends. They could be lobbying an agency as well. In all-time spending, so again, we have data dating back to 1998, pharma and insurance take the top 2 slots for the most spent on lobbying, which will become really interesting this coming year with the appointment of RFK. Yes.
So when you said 20 billion in the beginning, are you including lobbying?
Exactly.
In that?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
So when you take out the lobbying money, how much is actually spent on campaigns and elections?
About 16 to 17 billion. We're still totaling the state side because we have money at this data on the state level. And the last filing will come in actually in a week from now. And so we anticipate that the total campaign spend will net out close to 16 billion.
So that's kind of it's changed over the last 20 years, where most money used to be spent on lobbying and a little bit on campaign.
Exactly.
That's kind of flipped.
Yep. 20 years ago, most of the campaign money was actually for presidential candidates coming from the federal government. And that changed in the 90s when two candidates, Ross Perot and I believe Forbes, self-financed their elections. And then it significantly changed when Barack Obama declined federal funding in favor of doing private fundraising, and that just blew the cap off. It's now the norm that presidential candidates don't accept federal funding and opt to instead fundraise on their own.
And I think the Pennsylvania Senate race was very high priced this year, is that correct? Like,
In Ohio.
Ohio also.
Yeah.
In Florida mistakenly.
So why, yeah. It's interesting, you know, typically you see industry spending a lot on lobbying when regulation becomes part of the equation. Usually it's an indication that an industry wants to be a part of the conversation. Either there's a threat with regulation that will impact the bottom line, and so people want to be a part of that conversation. And I have three really interesting examples of that over the years. In 2009, there was a heated debate from the federal government about instituting a sugary beverage tax, basically. And what do you guys notice between 2008 and 2009? I mean, it's drastic. It's pretty much playbook, textbook that you see. Like, that's an almost nearly triple the amount of lobbying spending between 2008 and 2009 because the sugary beverage industry did not want a tax on sugary beverages. That wouldn't be good for the sugary beverage industry. Similarly, we saw it in health insurance companies in response to the Affordable Care Act between 2008 and 2009. You'll notice that the amount that they spent between 2008 and 2009 was significantly higher than any other typical increase. And finally, this last panel was talking a lot about AI. We've seen an explosion in the total number of registered organizations lobbying on AI issues, as well as the total amount of money being spent. And of course, that's because the big capital R word, regulation, has been being thrown around, and the AI companies, of course, want to be a part of that conversation.
You don't differentiate between regulatory and regulatory capture?
Say more.
Regulatory capture is where the regulatory agency has like this, you know, swinging door of people who are executives who then go to.
Oh yeah, we call that the revolving door at Open Secrets. And so our team tracks any registered lobbyist who has previously worked in government and then goes to the private sector. You'll see a little revolving door icon next to their name. And basically that indicates, oh, we've been on both sides. And what's interesting is the industry that has the highest percentage of revolvers we call them, which is in this industry, 75%. Can anyone guess who is the highest number of revolvers? Military, the defense industry.
Dick Cheney and what's the other guy from Bush? What's the guy?
Halliburton?
The guy, well, the Dick Cheney was at Halliburton, and then there was the other guy who was
Bechtel?
Secretary of Defense, I'll get his name. Rumsfeld, thank you.
Yeah.
So far,
Yeah, so we track revolving door lobbyists as well. And pharma, of course, you see that too, but defense is by far the highest percentage. So what else to watch in 2025? I picked 5 things that I think are valuable for us to watch. The first is pharma. I mentioned this a little bit, but with RFK leading HHS and pharma every single year topping the list of lobbying spend, I think we're going to see some interesting activity next year with RFK vowing to sort of dismantle the interlocking loop of pharma, insurance, and health. And similarly, big food. He's vowed to take on big food. We've seen over the last several years, food processing companies spend more on lobbying. And also this year, the Farm Bill is up for renewal, which will set the course for everything from food programs to farm credit and subsidies for the next 5 to 6 years. So I think we anticipate seeing a lot more spent on lobbying from big food, big ag. And then a quick window, there's, you know, lobbying, and then there's also campaign contributions. This is 2024's campaign contributions from big food, and you'll notice that most of these are leaning which way?
red.
Yes, most of the donations coming from big food, processed food companies went to Republican candidates. Next, insurance is one to watch, of course. There are dozens of insurance companies who spend north of $1 million every year in lobbying, and we anticipate that to increase with RFK heading up HHS. Of course, Mara, you mentioned crypto. Over the last 4 years, and of course, again, this is an indication of a new industry
Look at
that's
that, huh?
trying to be a part of the conversations. This is pretty drastic. In 2018, crypto spent $312,000. 6 years later, that leapt up to 121 million. Clearly, this reflects an industry trying to get on the agenda. And this past year,
But you go back to, you just say crypto, that's a nothing. 121, I mean, probably there's, many crypto billionaires who just made that money in the last, individually made that money in the last month. Just from
Absolutely.
Trump getting in office.
I anticipate we'll see that increase next year on the lobbying side of things. This is all specific to campaign contributions in election cycles. So definitely one to watch for the lobbying spend this next year. And of course, we've got Elon Musk, a tech adjacent player that's been very involved in this last election cycle, which is novel because typically in our industry, in politics, you see the same old players joining in the fight. In this past election cycle, we saw a lot of new players joining, Elon being one of them. And he has a lot to gain. His companies all have very high numbers in federal contracts. Tesla has received 40 million total in federal contracts since 2008 in benefits from subsidies and tax breaks. Of course, SpaceX has billions in the federal contracts and could be much higher if Mars becomes a target. And last, Starlink, of course, is fighting to get subsidies for rural broadband, and the FCC chair seems to be quite favorable to Starlink as well. So it's worth watching his companies in the coming year as well in terms of lobbying spending. And then other tech, this is just for fun. I think it's worth noting again that as shown in the chart, as tech has hit the scene, they've spent a lot more on lobbying, and the top 3 companies that spend are Meta, Amazon, and Alphabet, no surprise there. And finally, of course, oil should be interesting. The future appointee owns Liberty Energy, and it's on the board of Aqua. So again, there's a lot more work that our team could be doing and will be doing in terms of understanding who the appointees are and what to look out for in terms of potential conflicts of interest. And finally, in this next year, we have 2 gubernatorial races in Virginia and New Jersey. And so we also track spending at the state level, and it'll be worth watching who joins the fight there. So thank you, and happy to take any questions, yes.
So in 2020, Bloomberg decided he was going to spend $1 billion to get the nomination. Spent 150 million and decided not to spend the rest. Was he visible at all in 2024?
He was. The top 7 donors were Republican for mega donors, and the 8th was Michael Bloomberg. It's hard to see, but he's down there. He's the top spender, the top mega donor to the Democrats this year. But that's in part, you bring up a good point, the question around why did the leap from 16 to 20 increase so significantly? And one of the big reasons that is because 2020 had such a large Democratic primary. And so in general, a lot more capital went into the entire cycle because there were, 12 candidates trying to vie for that nomination.
And I guess the other question is, given the tariff issues, I mean, there's got to be a tsunami of money coming in to protect.
Yeah, I anticipate.
Food and energy.
Absolutely. The question is about the tariff issue, and I think we're going to see also an increased spend in those sectors, which you won't really see that until Q1 probably next year when we download the lobbying data, because it's usually that doesn't get reported out until after the fact.
And just help me out, the lobbying money just goes to talk to the politicians. I mean, it doesn't go into their pocket directly, I assume.
We can assume so.
I don't know.
We can assume so. I think there's a myriad of ways that lobbying actually takes shape in reality, but yes, there's a multitude of sort of methods, I think, deployed in order to be able to secure an opportunity to speak to a member of Congress or an agency to get on the agenda.
Can you give us 2 more sentences about that?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think there are activities that are lawfully okay and ones that aren't. And I think, whether it's taking a member of Congress to dinner and giving them, a check there, or, of course, staying away from the notion of flying somebody on a private jet to an island owned by you is, of course, maybe not within. Yes.
Question about open secret itself. How do you make money from this data?
It's a great question. So.
Do you make money?
We don't. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and our origin story has been that this data should be open and available to the public. I will say that being brought in January was a bit of an inflection point for the organization. Historically, 90% of our budget has come from large institutional foundations. And increasingly, we've noticed that those foundations are wanting to spend more partisan ways. Especially this year, they were hyper-focused on a specific election outcome. So as an organization, I'm actually working to pivot our business model to be able to pilot a membership portion that would build out tooling for folks pro users to query our data in a lot more sophisticated of ways and automate an export of a data sheet. You could, feasibly, you could ask, I want to see every single contribution from a lawyer in the last 20 years that went to a member of Congress who cares about the environment. I mean, it could get that specific, and so we'd like to build out that tooling, and ideally with conversational AI from this last, talk as well, the ability to query our database in much more user-friendly ways.
So you're shifting from the institutional base and trying to democratize out there.
Exactly, trying to shore up our own financial and fiscal independence to be able to weather the years when institutional foundation money is more difficult to come by as it was in this year.
How big is the endowment?
We actually don't have an endowment, shockingly. We've been around for 40 years, and this organization has really been like every year flying by the seat of its pants.
Might as well be new.
Scraping together grant funding. So that's actually on a goal of mine as well, is to make sure that we have sustainability to operate.
Do you charge people for data access?
Most of our data is open and free. We have 10% of our budget, which is in the form of B2B contracts. So for a private corporation that wants specific slices of our data that are more, cumbersome or complex for us to build, we will in that instance charge a nominal fee for them.
Do you charge lobbying groups?
That's the segment I'd love to capture, because all of our lobbying data is open and available. We're the only ones who have the lobbying data available in such a user-friendly way and dating back, because data, even the FEC for elections deletes its data every 6 years. So we're kind of a library for that matter that's preserved all of this historical data for decades. And lobbyists, I can't tell you guys the number of conferences I've been to and I meet a lobbyist and they're like, oh, you work for Open Secrets, I use your data all the time to plot my, my angle of attack and figure out what the opposition is doing. And so that for me was like, oh shit, you should be paying for our data. I mean, man, just lining your pockets a little more, but that's the segment that I'd love to be able to capture with a nominal membership model pilot as well. Yes.
Have you had any restrictions on what data you cannot sell, quote unquote, and to whom you can't sell?
Such a good question. So yes, in the sense that it's actually illegal for a political candidate to fundraise off of historical candidates' fundraising. So if you go to our website and you look up a candidate and see all of their historical donors, we insert little disclaimers like, you're not allowed to use this as a call list, you're not allowed to use this as a call list. I know from, again, going to conferences and meeting folks that have said, I run for political office, I use your data all the time, I use it to, gather the people and get a call to ask for money, I'm like, ooh, well, that's technically not legal, but because we make the data open and available on our site, we can't necessarily control what people do with that data. But in, you know, in actuality, it is not okay for folks to use that data to create a fundraising list and run for political office from it.
This is really
Great.
fascinating. You're gonna stick around a couple of minutes? I
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
know
yeah.
what you do, so.
Yes.
We work with a lot of different nonprofits, all kinds of strategies. Open the Books
Yeah.
was funded by the founder, because he had an exit from a company he started.
Oh, wow.
He was able to fund most of it, and then the rest was like from
Amazing.
libertarian organizations, stuff like that. So
Yeah, we were founded by retired Republican and Democrat senators, so I love her.
that's right.
Yeah.
Great.
But thank you all so much, and thanks for having me.
Great job, Elizabeth.